Konnichiwa, this is the Shogunstein, and this is some historical background of the new game from Huch and R&R Games, and that is the East India Companies. And there's some controversy about the theme of this game, so I just want to give some historical background here. And let me just read from the rulebook. Disclaimer. East Indian Companies is first and foremost a game without political considerations. The historical setting is only there to reinforce the mechanics, which fits perfectly with the team that surrounds it. It deals with another time with other reference points than ours. East India Companies is a game, a work of fiction, but in no way a documentary, and it must be considered as such. And I like this in the rule book. I like how it is saying this because I had purchased another game a few months back that had a theme involving pirates, and there was also a disclaimer in there. And after, of course, I spent my money and bought the game, and they got my money, there was a disclaimer in there saying basically how bad pirates are and what a terrible person I am for buying the game with the theme of the pirates. So I do like the way this is worded here. I think it's a good disclaimer, but there are going to be people who disagree with that, and I understand that. So I want to bring up some of the historical background here and discuss some of the history here, and again, to allow you to form your own opinions about the history involved and the game. I do have a side hustle in history, and I do my best in my side hustle to always present both sides and allow people to make an intelligent decision based on primary sources and factual information, but most importantly using primary sources and letting people to make up their own mind. So with that said, I also want to stress that at no point in this historical background am I defending colonialism or imperialism or some of the things that happened as a result of colonialism and imperialism. I also want to say that I think that if you do not like a game company, and if the reason you don't like a game company is you feel they made a game that you don't like, by all means, don't buy it. If that's probably the best way, if you're upset at a game company for whatever reason or any product, if you get them with your wallet or the pocketbook. That's the best way. So if you think that this is a theme that's inappropriate, don't buy the game. Don't give them your money. At the same time, I do strongly believe that if other people do want to play the game, they should be allowed to play the game. And this doesn't just apply to games. This applies to movies, music, books, lots of other things. By all means, hit them in the old bank account. That's a great thing to do. But at the same time, if someone has a different opinion, let them, do what they want to do. If they want to read that book, if they want to listen to that music, if they want to play that game, let them. So again, I'm not endorsing or trying to defend colonialism. Absolutely not. But at the same time, I think that if this is a theme that interests you, you should be allowed to play the game. And if this is a theme that you don't like and you don't like the whole idea of this theme, then again, don't buy the game, don't play the game. I also think that there's a lot of inconsistencies in board gaming over historical controversies. It seems like we're okay with some history that's certainly problematic. Look at all the Viking games we have. Look at all the games that involve recently like the Great Wall, Qin Shi Huangdi, the very brutal first emperor of China. So again, or very recently, I got a game that involved the Ottoman Empire. Think about what the Ottoman Empire did to the Armenians. So if we want to do the historical outrage, then we got to be consistent with the historical outrage. I don't like conquistadors. I don't support what the conquistadors did when they came to the Americas, but I don't think you can be mad at conquistadors, but okay with a Viking pillage. And that's just me. So again, I think there's just a lot of inconsistencies in board gaming involving historical topics. If you know, my as someone that has a side gig in history, I enjoy historical topics, and I hope that these topics will lead to, if we use these themes in games, it'll lead to discussions about the theme and people learning the history, and and if it was a bad thing, hopefully they learn the history in order to prevent it from happening again. So I like the idea of historical themes in books, historical novels, movies, TV shows, and games, because if it gets people interested in the topic and they learn more, it's a win-win. So let someone learn about the East India Company, and if they conclude that it was a terrible organization that had a terrible legacy, then at least they studied it and they learned it and they found something out. They learned something about it. I think if you try to erase it from memory, then how are you going to prevent bad things from happening if you never knew they happened? So I'm big on historical themes in not just games but movies, TV shows, because I think it does generate further interest in the topic and let people do some research and find out for themselves, what happened, and draw their own conclusions. We want people to be able to critically think for themselves. We don't want people just to do what, authority people tell them they're supposed to believe. And I don't think you can do that if you just erase themes. And again, if you just have a bunch of games that are cartoon animals, you know, that to me, I like cartoon animals just as much as the next person. But I really do like these historical themes, and I like the conversations that they generate. Also, on a personal note, in addition to my side hustle in history, Mrs. Shogenstein is from Malaysia, and Malaysia is an important part of this story with trade in the Indian Ocean. As the To get to a lot of the big places, you had to go through the Straits of Malacca. So my wife's country was heavily impacted by all of these events, and Mrs. Shogenstein has an opinion about what happened in her country of origin, and I'm not going to speak for her, but I have to respect that that's another perspective we need to keep in mind. As someone who grew up in Malaysia and dealt with the impact of the Indian Ocean trade and British colonization, she has a point of view that I think is important and needs to be respected also. So I look at it from, history perspective, someone again with a side gig in history, but Mrs. Shogenstein actually lived in a country that, directly has, consequences or results, positive or negative, regarding what happened in this time period. So it's easy for me to look at a book and say this or say that. She actually lived there and grew up there and went through schooling there and has an opinion that comes from a totally different place than my opinion, which comes from books. Her opinion comes from actually living and growing up in Malaysia. And again, the Straits of Malacca are very important. So again, what I like about historical themes, I don't think people realize how important Malacca and going through these straits was to connecting the cultures of places like China, India, Southeast Asia, and the east coast of Africa. So let's get into a little more of the historical perspective now of East India companies. So when we look at the perspective here, we kind of got to go back to the Crusades, because the Crusades, that kind of ends feudalism in Europe, and you're going to start getting Europeans traveling. In the case of the Crusades, they're going to Asia and they're discovering spices. So we're going to get the start of the spice trade and the age of exploration as a result of the Crusades. Now, prior to the Crusades, we had the Silk Road. That was the way that people traded um, between, could be the end of the Roman Empire all the way to Xi'an, China. That was the traditional trade route, and that goes back to very early times. Buddhism is going to spread to China via the Silk Road. Islam will spread to China through the Silk Road. And for a time, the Silk Road was safe or safer to travel, say in the time of Marco Polo, as this part of the world was under the rule of the Mongols, and that extended to the Yuan dynasty, which was the Mongols' Kublai Khan in China, and the Silk Road was protected by the Mongols. When the Mongols are defeated, when the Yuan is overthrown, the Silk Road is not going to be a viable way for the trade of spice. It's also much slower, dangerous. So Europeans are going to be looking for different ways, faster ways to get to Asia for spices. And in 1493, it's Vasco da Gama that sails around the Cape of Good Hope. He basically sails from Portugal around Africa to Asia, and that is going to be considered the first European to figure that out. Now, let's take a step back, because before we get to the Europeans and the East Indian companies, we also have to look at what was going on in the Indian Ocean before. There was trade and mercantilism before the East India Company. Speaking of mercantilism, that's a term we're going to be hearing a lot when we discuss the historical background here, and it's important to understand when looking at these events. So what's mercantilism? Mercantilism is an economic system that's tied in with colonialism. It's basically the colonizing country, the mother country, takes the resources from the colony. So in mercantilism, colonies are very important. So in a mercantile system, like is going to happen in when the Europeans start entering this trade, but to some extent it existed in some of the trade cities and what we're going to talk about with the Indian Ocean trade before the Europeans got there. But in terms of European imperialism, we have to talk about mercantilism. And mercantilism, again, involves colonies. It involves liquid currency, meaning actually having gold and silver. And it involves taking the resources from the colony, turning it into some sort of manufactured good, and then basically destroying the local economies of the place you colonized by selling them, or making them trade with, again, the colonial power, the mother country, for mass-produced, much cheaper goods. So you destroy local, crafts and, again, handmade stuff, as, again, the European countries steal the resources, take the resources from the colony, bring it back, turn it into a manufactured good, and then basically force you to buy the product that they made with the resources they stole from you. And mercantilism is going to be a policy the British used on their 13 North American colonies, which we didn't like. Those 13 colonies did not like mercantilism. For instance, when they were told they had to buy the tea from the British. We know how that ended. Thomas Paine, in some of his writings about why the 13 colonies should not be part of the British Empire, he talked about how mercantilism is a terrible system. But mercantilism is important to understand in this story. And also, let's now move on to what was going on before the Europeans showed up in this part of the world. So trade didn't just start with the Gama in 1493. So look at this picture here. Here is a person in China with a giraffe. Now we know giraffes are from Africa. They're not native to China. How did they get to China? There are, again, paintings like this of giraffes in the Forbidden City. There are Ming Dynasty porcelain pieces found in East Africa. Well, that's because prior to the Europeans showing up in the East India Companies, there was a very healthy Indian Ocean trade that was going on long before da Gama sailed around Africa. So Indian Ocean trade existed prior. Now, Indian Ocean trade involved a lot of different places. We're talking, it involved Mongol-controlled China, Yuan dynasty, then later the Ming dynasty. It involved what's going to eventually be the Ottoman Empire and the Safavid Empire, and not the Mongol Empire, but the Mughal Empire. That's in India. So those three Islamic empires. It's going to involve the Swahili coast in East Africa. Places like Mogadishu. So we have Indian Ocean trade, which is connecting China, India, parts of the Middle East, and the east coast of Africa. They're going to use those monsoon winds to sail around. Cities like Calcutta in India, these were considered very mercantile cities. Now again, not the same kind of mercantilism the Europeans are going to use, but there are going to be some similarities. And again, the Straits of Malacca, very important as people are going through. Now, not defending bad behavior with more bad behavior, and the East India Company's role in slavery is not any way diminished by what I'm going to say next, but there is also slavery involved in the Indian Ocean trade, and that's before the Europeans got there. There is an element of slavery here where, again, the slaves are mostly being taken from that Swahili coast, and they're being brought to places like the Byzantine Empire, and then later, what's going to be the Ottoman Empire. And you're going to have a large amount of slaves from Africa that are part of Indian Ocean trade. At one point, in about 869, in what today would probably be Iraq, there is a giant slave revolt. Now, these slaves were slaves taken from mostly the Swahili coast. It's called I'm probably saying this wrong, but the Zanj, Z-A-N-J, the Zanj Rebellion, and they say it involved up to 500,000 slaves from Africa that via Indian Ocean trade were brought into what today would be Iraq. So, again, this doesn't take away from any involvement in slavery in the East India Company, but it is not, only the East India Company. Now, this also included with the Indian Ocean the voyages of the Chinese treasure fleet Zheng He, which may have, before da Gama, gone around the coast of Africa, and maybe even before Magellan, done a circumnavigation of the world. There are 7 voyages involving Zheng He and the treasure fleets. Now, back to the theme of the game and the East India Companies. Well, what's going to be the East India Company starts in around 1600. Now, it's going to go through some name changes by the time it's disbanded in the 1800s, but it's mostly, known as the East India Company. Again, it does go through some name changes, and I think it's finally officially disbanded in the 1870s. And it started off, like it said, trading. Then it became more political, and then in many ways it became an official participant, the way that the British imperialized. And in the theme of this game, we are looking at, again, the Indian Ocean. So we're not looking at the Atlantic Ocean in terms of a theme of this game. Though the East India Company was involved in some ways with the Atlantic, the triangle trade, and unfortunately, terrible things like the Atlantic slave trade and Middle Passage. But this game is dealing more with its involvement in East India Company's involvement in the Indian Ocean trade. So in that case, the starting in probably about the 1620s, the East India Company did get involved in Indian Ocean slave trade out of East Africa, where most of the slaves were coming out of Mozambique and Madagascar. So when we look at the slavery issue involving the East India Companies, we're mostly looking at Indian Ocean slave trade, which again doesn't make any version of it any better. I'm not trying to do that. Whether it was the Indian Ocean trade when it was the China and India and the Swahili coast, or whether it was the East India Company, it's terrible. But a lot of people don't realize that there was a slave trade in the Indian Ocean and not just the Atlantic Ocean, because I think a lot more people know about the triangle trade than they do about Indian Ocean trade. Now, I say that, but I got to be honest with you. When I was a kid, I didn't know anything about the Middle Passage until, in school, I remember them showing us routes. And I remember even when I had my side hustle first started involving history, when I was still a student side hustler in history, I remember the people I was working with still showing routes in the classroom. I don't I can't think of anyone that shows routes anymore. It was a very powerful lesson for me. Now, maybe it's because they don't want film shown as much in school. I think it's a shame because that really opened up, the horrors of the Middle Passage to a lot of people that probably didn't even know it happened. But you can read, say the writings of Equiano. That's a good primary source on Middle Passage. Maybe if you're into film, maybe Amistad, the Steven Spielberg. But again, for me, as a young kid, I knew about triangle trade, but I didn't really know the horrors of Middle Passage until I saw Roots. And again, you can read again the excellent primary source writings of Equiano. But my point being that a lot of people know much more about triangle trade than slavery in the Indian Ocean trade. So again, starting in the 1620s, you had slaves taken mostly from East Africa from Mozambique and Madagascar as a part of the East India Company's involvement now in trade. Now, also important is, and again, this is just important historically, when talking about the East India Company, the setup, this whole idea that in England you had these joint stock companies. That's very important for the whole time period of colonization and moving into industrial revolution. This business model, joint stock company, is something people who want to study business history, or again, even just history, if you want to understand the motivations of colonization and imperialism, you got to know about joint stock companies. So if this game kind of teaches more about joint stock companies, I think that's good, and I think maybe that'll help us understand better what exactly happened and why. Again, it's an important concept. Also, it's important, why did the British even form this company? Well, before the British were in the spice trade, the first two are the Spanish and the Portuguese. So this was done as, again, to rival the Spanish and the Portuguese, and there's a whole religious element involved in that too, as the Spanish, the Portuguese are Catholic, and the English and the Dutch are Protestant. And in terms of colonization in the Americas, you can have this whole idea of what's called the Black Legend, where the Protestant colonizers are going to, portray the Catholic colonizers, the Spanish, in a very nasty, in an even more nasty way that, again, has its roots in some religious differences. So one thing also important, again, this is not in any way, again, to defend or try and diminish the slavery part or involvement of the East India Company, but in terms of this story, it's important to remember that England abolished the slave trade and then abolished slavery earlier than the United States. So even though from the 1730s and 1750s, the East India Company was participating in slave trade as part of the Indian Ocean trade, again, from East Africa, again, taking most of its people, stealing, again, contributing to the diaspora of people from Africa, and in this case, again, Mozambique, Madagascar, from the 1730s to 1750s. But with the help of people like Equiano and the importance of his writings, and Wilberforce, who was an English politician, in 1807, the British outlawed the slave trade, and by 1833, they had full abolition. The United States isn't going to abolish slavery until after a civil war where 700,000 people are killed, and that's going to be, again, with the 13th and the 14th Amendment, and that's 1865. So a big reason that the British ended up not helping the Confederacy in the Civil War is that they turned very anti-slavery to the point where when Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation, there was no longer any chance the people of England were going to support backing the Confederacy, as the Confederacy was fighting for slavery, which is something the English had gotten rid of earlier. Now, also that's important to discuss with this topic is what the East India Company did in India. And again, they're going to come in as the Mughal Empire, which was a very powerful empire, an Islamic empire in India. If you know